for people who are going through chronic stress, it can be double or triple that amount of money. But that's only come about in the last few years. So what we want to try and do, that in some way, shape or form, we should be able to control our brains. Yeah, we should be able to control everything that's going on around us. But the reality is that we can't.
You are stressed and you know you're on the tipping point, but it's just like a train. It keeps going and there's nothing slowing it down. How does a person catch themselves in the moment?
Yeah, and I use the techniques, the diffusion, the acceptance, and I then just carried on with my day. And the really interesting thing was that I hardly ever get that now. You know, as human beings, we can kind of manifest a physiological response to a thought. You know what I mean? So we can think about, this, we can do this catastrophizing about what, such and such is going to mean. And if we play that scenario through, even though it's potentially very unlikely, we can cause those.
Give me 2 seconds, my break.
You've done a good job of setting all this up, mate. I'm very impressed. And I've been sitting here kind of watching you and drinking coffee. It's just been, quite,
I know, and my coffee's
chilled.
all the way over there. And I'll have it later. That's not a problem.
To warm it in the microwave. So anyway,
I don't know.
it'll be iced coffee in the current temperatures.
I mean, in my mind, when I worked it out last night, I was like, yeah, I'll be quicker because I've only got to take 2 pours down and everything. So that's the whole point of prep in the night. What sometimes is in your mind and what actually happens is 2 different things.
Oh, yes.
So we'll talk through the video again, because this is the 3rd video that you've done, which is talking about the effects of cortisol and how ACT can help. One of the things that I'm really, really pleased with, I'm proud of actually, is the fact of you're just coming in and you're getting it done within 15 minutes.
Yeah, I know. That was pretty awesome, actually, I have to say. Just it just worked so well today, didn't it? Just coming in, sitting down, obviously made a couple of tweaks to the script beforehand.
You even made yourself a coffee?
Made myself a coffee, yeah. It's only 4 stars on Google reviews now.
TripAdvisor,
I had to make my own coffee at one point. But other than that, it's been pretty amazing. But no, it's been really cool today. I liked just being able to do a little bit of script editing.
Yeah.
And then you uploading it to teleprompter, and then I think we managed to get through the whole thing and maybe did maybe 2 or 3 takes at a couple of parts.
It was
but it was pretty seamless. I mean, I think we probably did the 10 minutes in the total of the video 10 minutes in about 15 minutes. So to get through it that quickly compared to the first attempt, which probably took us about 3 hours to do, about 6 minutes, I think. But now, we've got it down to a fine art, I think.
It is coming really well, and what's really helping is because we're doing the blog first, and we've got everything in our mindset about the topic, which is about cortisol and how ACT. It's fantastic because it preps your mind into gearing up to delivering it, and you're handling the teleprompter fantastic. So what we're going to do now is I'm actually going to introduce who this lovely person is. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I certainly can.
You can.
So I'm Dan Farmer from Anxious to Zen-ish.
Yeah.
And my business teaches the employees of companies how to develop something called psychological flexibility, which most other people know as resilience. Resilience to the inevitability of life's events. Things happen.
Life's challenges, which are
absolutely
these days in abundance, and it doesn't always come from one direction, which can be a massive complication for people because it comes from every angle.
Yeah, myriad of sources these days, because we're not, go back, only say 100 years or so, people were, tended to live in quite small communities, relatively speaking, unless you were in a very large city. So you didn't have many people, to compare yourself with, to be concerned about, the amount of news that was getting through was relatively small. But in the last, it's got to be 20 odd years or so, 20 plus years, the rise of 24-hour news, the increase in social media platforms, things like YouTube really coming on stream, which I know this is actually being promoted on to some extent.
Yeah.
But it gives us the ability not only to be concerned about the future. Social media allows us to compare ourselves to beautiful and talented people all over the world, and to start having the inevitable thoughts of, why aren't I good enough? Why don't I meet up or match up rather to, those perfection expectations that seem to be, riddled throughout society. And it's no coincidence that a local government report, I can't remember exactly which year it was, can't remember off the top of my head, but it did state that mental health amongst all age groups has been deteriorating over the last 20 years, especially in children. That's and children are the ones who've been most exposed to this technological increase, which has thrown a lot more information at us. But at the same time, they've got very plastic brains. Their brains are still developing. Us older stages, our brains are not as plastic. We can't learn things as fast as we could when we were kids. That's just part of, our growth cycle. So we are feeding children a huge amount of information, some of which is processed by this amazing prefrontal cortex up here and is perceived in a particular way. Because, whatever we take in, we put our own judgments on effectively. We perceive it in a particular way. And as a general rule, as we've certainly talked about before, as human beings, we tend to be negatively biased because that keeps us safe. So we see something, we see it from a negative perspective. We often struggle with our mental health as a consequence of that. And we're seeing this laid bare in a lot of the research that's being done at the moment. And, whilst it's not conclusive as to what's causing it, I think there's some very well-educated guesses as to what has been causing that rise in mental health. And certainly, you talk about what's gone on with COVID over the last few years, cost of living crisis and various other things of that that nature, all contributes. And there's probably no one single thing that people can point to and say that's what's causing it. But I would argue that the amount of information that's being poured into this melon between our ears is certainly not helping the situation in any way, shape or form. And people need to learn where the brakes are of this thing so they don't get caught up in the thinking. They're able to stop themselves before they go down that route of worry and catastrophization and, what we call anxiety, which is future-orientated fear, essentially. What's going to happen in the future?
And this directly relates to the video that we've just recorded now, which is about the cortisol levels. Do you want to briefly give an introduction on that, why you decided to tackle this video on this particular topic?
I decided to do it partly because there's been quite a lot in the papers and on news platforms about cortisol in recent times. There's been certain articles out there about how stress, or at least a perception of stress, when you kind of go to your doctor about it, so this, I guess what people would call chronic stress, how that's affecting insurance premiums, which I thought was amazing. This is life insurance premiums now, because it is seen as so detrimental to our well-being and to our physical health that it's actually pushing up people's premiums significantly. So what might have been a 20 or 30, 40 pounds a month premium, for people who are going through chronic stress, it can be double or triple that amount of money. But that's only come about in the last few years. So what we want to try and do is to recognize when people are living in chronic stress, which is when essentially their body is producing cortisol far more of the time than is sensible, frankly, or what you'd want to happen, because having cortisol and other stress hormones is important. We need them to survive. But it's like anything. You don't want it all the time because that causes its own problems. So from my perspective, I wanted to tackle this particular concern that people have raised with me, and just show how ACT can help, how ACT can stop us from getting caught up in the cycle of thoughts, which leads to the production of stress hormones to actually, bring ourselves back into balance and not get carried, effectively down the rabbit hole, if you like, of overthinking, which is, let's be honest, what a lot of us do at particular points in time. I certainly did a huge amount of it. And at times, if I let myself, I probably still would.
I know that I overthink a lot, but I've turned it for myself, especially in this job. I overthink of all the scenarios that can go wrong, like on the day of the shoot and everything. I've learned to use that now as more of a power, so that if I'm worrying about that, I go, okay, so that is the worry. What is the solution? And if it's something I can actively do myself, I will. And I know then that there's a lot that's just purely down to luck and chance. And once I've realized that, I don't think about it. Do you think people have, I've come to that realization myself, but do you think a lot of people don't get to that naturally and they struggle with that?
They do. There's a belief, and to some extent, this points to us as human beings being a little bit arrogant, frankly. There's a belief that because we are so cognitively aware, I think, therefore I am, and we have language and abstract thoughts and all this kind of stuff, that in some way, shape or form, we should be able to control our brains. We should be able to control everything that's going on around us. But the reality is that we can't. This part of our brain, this prefrontal cortex, or the neocortex, which there's a bit of a hint in there, it's new, relatively speaking, is a fantastic piece of kit for problem solving, but it's also hooked up to a bit of a threat center. So you're getting stories produced, which is linked up to a threat center, and your mind then wants to control. Now, if there is no mechanism or action that can be reasonably taken, or you are responding inappropriately to a particular thought, you're actually going to end up getting more of the anxiety in the future. But what we talk about in ACT is saying, okay, well, a thought comes up and it's either helpful or it's unhelpful. And if we have a helpful thought, we take action in respect of it. So what you were talking about just now, if you're going on a shoot, you'll have thoughts, things, you'll be thinking, oh, what could possibly go wrong? Okay, well, what can I actually deal with here? You deal with the solvable, if you like, and the unsolvable becomes something that, you kind of let go of. And that's the acceptance that we can't be in control of everything. I came up with a good one the other day, even if I do say so myself.
Toot your own horn.
Yeah, well, occasionally one's got to toot their own horn, haven't they? You know what I mean? But it was all about like a bar of soap, right? So a bar of soap that we hold in our hands, we need it, to have enough control over it in order to wash ourselves while having a shower, let's say, But if you squeeze that bar of soap too hard, it's going to shoot out your hand. And that's what we're talking about, sometimes with our attempts at controlling everything. And the reality is that the more we try to control and the less control that we have, the more stressed we often get, the more, stress hormones we start to pump into our bodies, and the more we narrow our focus into whatever's bothering us. And, eventually, if most people kind of have, I have this concept like a stress bucket. We all have a point at which we get really stressed and then that sort of explodes. So I talk about this stress bucket, right? So if our stress bucket gets to a certain level and we're allowing it to get to that level because we're trying to overly control our life or existence or our thoughts or whatever's going on for us, once that overflows, guess what happens? People start, ranting and raving, road rage, arguments with partners, getting cross with the children, whatever it might be, throwing a wobbly at work, swearing at a customer. Who knows? It could be a myriad of things. No, you haven't sworn at me yet, but I'm sure it's only a matter of time. I know some customers are more difficult than others, aren't they, Byron? So I do accept that. But Yeah, the whole point of this is that what we're trying to do is, I guess, recognize that when we try to apply too much control in our lives, we end up actually kind of losing a bit of control. We end up stressing ourselves more. So we're producing more stress hormones. And, eventually the bucket overflows and we explode. And, the consequences can be quite severe potentially. Yeah. So what we try to do with this stuff is to minimize, or keep the stress level at a level where it's kind of bouncing up and down between, a minimum and maximum, never completely empty because that's unrealistic in life, but never completely full and overflowing. And another way that I like to describe it is that, we want to get our brains to be a bit like a spring, so that stuff happens in life that will cause the spring to compress or the spring to stretch, but we want it to come back to the kind of the same shape after a particular event is over. The reality is that for a lot of people who might have a kind of relatively easy life up to a point, go through a stressful experience, but because they've never cultivated any resilience or psychological flexibility, actually their brains are a bit more like glass, something that can fracture in response to that particular event. So whilst what I talk about isn't necessarily just about dealing with stress in the moment or dealing with anxiety or depression or whatever it is in the moment, it's also about prevention and actually building up the skill set so that when, the difficult situation does happen, you're already in a position to deal with it better.
So on reflection then, when someone has perhaps gone through ACT, sometimes it's trying to catch yourself in the heat of the moment when you are stressed and you know you're on the tipping point, but it's just like a train. It keeps going and there's nothing slowing it down. How does a person catch themselves in the moment?
Yeah.
To try and recognize that, because that can be that sometimes is the breaking point, is knowing when to catch yourself.
Well, let's kind of go back to basics. If you have no awareness of how you're thinking, and people get habituated into behaviors, there's been a lot written about habituation of human behaviors. If you do get habituated into something, often people aren't even aware of the thoughts and then the subsequent emotions and the subsequent behaviors. So you've got to get to a point where you understand what it is that's showing up for you, what emotions that's driving, and then what actions that is pushing because of that.
Yeah.
So that it's getting that awareness first of all. And there are lots of different ways of cultivating awareness. Some people do meditation, some people do mindfulness techniques. And, it doesn't have to be anything particularly spiritual. A lot of the stuff that I do is actually very secular. There's no kind of religious or spiritual connotation to it. It is literally about me just gaining a bit more awareness over what's going on up here. Yeah. And, in my courses, I share quite a lot more detail about how I go about doing that. But if you can get to the point where you've got some awareness of what's going on up here, then you've got choice and you've got an opportunity to interrupt that cycle. So the awareness is the first bit. And then comes, how do I actually distance myself from what's going on? Because, you've had emotions before, I'm sure. They can feel uncomfortable at times if it's in response to something that's challenging in your life. They can feel horrible. They can feel like, some people, get it in their chest. Some people feel it in their gut. Some people feel it in their shoulders. They feel it in different parts of their body. And it's kind of, it's a language that's speaking to you to some extent in response to a particular thought. So in ACT, we have certain techniques, one called cognitive diffusion, another one which is emotional acceptance or willing acceptance is the proper term. And we use those after we've recognized to actually disconnect from a thought which is unhelpful. Now, remember I mentioned earlier there's helpful and unhelpful thoughts.
Yeah.
They're not good or bad. They're just helpful or unhelpful. And because, what's a good thought for me might be a bad thought for you and vice versa, because it's a completely subjective thing.
Yeah.
But thoughts are either helpful or they're unhelpful. So we look at it and we go, okay, well, is that particular thought aligned with my values and what's important to me? No, it's not. Therefore, it's an unhelpful thought. I will choose to diffuse it and accept the associated emotions, and then I'll realign myself towards what's important. And if you can do that, you will find after a period of time that you started to create this lovely virtuous cycle, and the monkey sitting on your shoulder that's banging the drum, shouting at you, pay attention to me, just gets that little bit quieter. And that's what I love about ACT. And it can be taught to anybody, and it will benefit almost anybody in our society.
And you mention a lot about abstract thought. Does that then go into the cycle of the bad thoughts because of the way that the brain plays out? And I know that you've said about mitigating that with ACT, but for someone who doesn't understand what an abstract thought is, can you elaborate a little bit on why it plays out in such a negative way?
Yeah, I mean, positive and negative. I tend not to try and make judgments of that nature, but abstract thought is what's allowed us to create this incredible world around us. It's why we are actually able to speak on camera at the moment. It's this ability to make connections so that we have one piece of information, we link it to another piece of information. So let's take a really basic, benign example. If I said to you that B was bigger than A and C was bigger than B, through language, you would immediately know that C must be bigger than A. Yeah. Or A must be smaller than C. That's an inference that's made. Now, that's a really basic, benign example. But that starts to happen on a larger scale in our brains. So we get fed one piece of information, we get fed another piece of information, we might make connections between those. There's a very good reason why humans love conspiracy theories, and also why conspiracy theories have actually, increased exponentially in the world of more information. Yes. Simply because we're getting more information and we're getting these, maybe seemingly related pieces of data, and then the inference is, oh, well, that's somebody said that and somebody else said that, therefore there must be kind of some connection between those two things, when potentially there isn't. So that's what the human brain does. Human brain also is negatively biased. So it will tend to focus on threat over growth and repair and procreate, because it wants to keep us alive so it can do all of those other things, and actually produce children and all the rest of it. So what we have a tendency to do is we will think something, we will link it to something else, and we'll see it from a negative perspective, or what we might perceive as being a negative perspective, because we are wired to focus on that threat. So if you've ever sat down and you've read a news article that's made you feel a little bit uncomfortable about something, and you felt a bit of an emotion there, that's your brain kind of reading that article and making a jump to a future potential. And we're flooded with this information now.
I'll give you an example. Have you seen the film Leave the World Behind on Netflix?
I haven't seen that one, no, actually. Not yet.
No. So my brain went off into a spiral, not because I thought it's realistic, it will happen or anything like that, but I was just thinking, right, okay, should it happen, do I have any form of communication? Okay, so I might need a walkie-talkie. Right, okay, so if I got a walkie-talkie, have I got a bag to put? No, I haven't got a bag to put it in, so I might need a bag. Right, well, how am I going to light the fire? Have I got anything? What happens if it? And my brain went off on to the point where I spent nearly £100 on Amazon.
Just buying, so if you
just buying crap, all because I allowed myself to go on this journey of not it will happen, but what if?
There you go. So
is it the same then adage as, like you said, B must be bigger than A and C is bigger than B? Say that was actual factual. Say those were numbers. What A was 1, B was 3, C was 5. But the way that our brain works is that if it wanted to, it's always going to go, that's the fact. But I'm telling you, he's bigger. And it rewrites that statement.
It is kind of possible to be, I don't know whether it's the right term, but sort of brainwashed, I guess, into believing, to believe something else. But the reality of the situation is that it's very rarely as cut and dried as that. When it comes to maths, that's very
simplistic.
It's simplistic and complicated at the same time, but it's absolute in most cases. When it comes to other facts, in inverted commas, most of them are skewed by perception. And if you read newspapers, and depending on their hue, whether it's a left-leaning paper or a right-leaning paper, they can report the same story, but you read it and you will get a completely different takeaway. So, if you read, for example, a story about Rishi Sunak with regard to something going on in the Mirror, and you read the same one in the Daily Express, you will guarantee that their point of view is going to be completely different, isn't it? Yeah. And they're both talking about the same story, but it's people's perceptions which then drive the conversation at that point. And then of course you've got people's individual what's the right word? I can't think of the right word at the moment. Their own belief systems, if you like. About so if you are a Conservative voter or a Labour voter, you will read each of those articles probably from a different perspective, and the Labour voter is likely to get upset with the Daily Express, and the Conservative voter is likely to get upset with the Mail. But again, they're coming from people coming from those standpoints, and that goes back to what I was saying before about thoughts aren't good or bad. They're just helpful or unhelpful because, as I say, what's a good thought for you might be a bad thought for me, and vice versa. It's completely subjective. It's down to the individual.
And that's one of the things that I've mentioned before in another video or blog that I'd done, was about understanding the client speak, and it was called Your Blue Monster. And that is the definition of it, exactly what you said. It is understanding what your definition of good and my definition of good, and then coming to an alignment. So I understand your definition of good, because it's no good me producing something for you when you've gone, oh, that's shit. And I've gone, isn't that amazing?
But it's amazing, at the moment, what we've got in the world currently is, rather than actually people coming together to have those conversations, to find middle ground, people becoming more and more staunchly opposed, even further and further apart. And again, there's possibly a lot to be said around what's, the kind of the social media. So depending on what you're consuming on a day-to-day basis in terms of your news, whether you're going to alternative news sites or whether you're consuming it directly from, say, the BBC or from, other sort of print-based, papers, that have got editorial oversight. But if you're not, if you're going to other places, you're going to get a different skewed view potentially. I'm not saying that's necessarily right or wrong, but it's just going to be different. And I guess if you're not consuming anything else, all it's going to do is move you in the direction of what it is that your readings sort of skew.
And you have to be very you have to read a lot of everything with a pinch of salt, because underlying that there's also a narrative of what they, even though they're reporting on what they believe the facts are, there's also sometimes a narrative of what, okay, these are the facts, but this is what I want you to believe. In newspaper,
I think there's certainly that, because they've got their own agendas as well.
I think, was it Denzel when he was doing that interview, and I'm not sure if I'm going to bastardize this or anything, but he said, if you don't read the news, you're not informed. And he said, if you do read the news, you're ill-informed. And it's just like, so what's the middle ground?
Exactly. But and I'm not, because inevitably everything that we're fed goes through a number of layers of perception and belief systems and editorial oversights and all the rest of it before it actually kind of gets consumed by us. So, if you're a particular expert in an area and you see a news story, quite often you view it and it's like, oh, I'm not too sure. It's either being oversimplified or it's wrong or something along those lines. But of course, if you're not an expert in that particular area, you take it as gospel.
Yeah,
and that's often not the case. But we've gotten off our subject a little bit. But
it's a good subject though.
It is a good subject. Absolutely.
We're talking about cortisol, and we'll get back on that. So the whole, like you mentioned before, about locking the front door.
Oh yeah,
I don't know, because we've talked about that before. But is there like other situations where that is a key factor? A key factor was a terrible fun, locking the bloody front door.
There we go. No pun
How
intended.
can someone like manage that?
Okay, so what I used to do, I used to be out and about somewhere, and I'd always get this, I say always, but most of the time at some point, I get this kind of nagging thought of, did I lock the front door? And then my brain would start to go into, catastrophizing about somebody's going to, break in, somebody's then going to kind of, nick my computer and steal my data and, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And they're going to steal my identity and my brain would just kind of go off on this sort of major tangent and all the rest of it. But what I recognized a lot of the time was that, whilst I knew logically that it was highly unlikely that I'd unlock the door in the first place, I also knew that it was highly unlikely that I would have unlocked or left the door unlocked on a day that somebody actually tried to break into the house.
Yeah.
You conflate those two together. The likelihood was infinitesimally small that anything like that was going to happen. But my brain was like, well, I don't care. I still see this as a threat because I thought it and therefore it's a possibility. So what I did was once I'd learned to act, was that I recognized that I had that thought, but I refused to engage in the behavior. And the behavior it wanted me to take was to leave wherever I was, go home and check. And I used the techniques, the diffusion, the acceptance, and I then just carried on with my day. And the really interesting thing was that I hardly ever get that now. But more than that, the number of times after doing that, because inevitably it did come up more often, but it rarely happens to me now.
Yeah.
But I would get home, I'd unlock the door, I'd go into the house, and then about 3/4 of an hour later, I'd suddenly remember that earlier on in the day, I'd been worried about whether I'd locked the door or not. And it just didn't even cross my mind for the rest of it until 3/4 of an hour after I got on home, and suddenly it just popped into my head of, oh yeah.
And then to reinforce that then as a reaffirmation for people, is it important to recognize at that point when they've gone, oh yeah, I worried about that earlier, and then to go, well, clearly it wasn't something to worry about?
I don't think so, particularly, because again, that's just giving more credence to the original concern. It was just like, oh yeah, and carry on.
Yeah.
That's how it's almost treat it as a sort of throwaway.
Cool.
I just don't engage with it because there's no requirement to engage with it. It's not like I'm actively avoiding it, but I'll acknowledge it. Oh yeah, forgot about that, and then carry on. But when you start to engage with unhelpful thoughts, is what the research into it. You give them more power.
Yeah.
You start to give them credence where no credence actually exists, and it's that ability to recognize when you get caught up in the unhelpful thoughts, do the diffusion, acceptance techniques, realign to what's important. That's where the power is. And as I say, I liken these thoughts like a bit of a monkey on my shoulder that's banging a drum. Okay. And at certain points when I get kind of caught up in those, this monkey potentially could be banging the drum quite loudly. But as I diffuse and accept, and I do that a number of times for different kinds of thoughts, it just gets a little bit quieter, and a little bit quieter, and a little bit quieter. And whereas previously, kind of this thing sitting on my shoulder became almost like the boss of me, because it was directing my actions to a large extent, because I felt anxiety, I felt I had to do what it was telling me to do. It doesn't direct my actions anymore. And that gives me so much more freedom.
Because I notice with myself as well, is that whilst I'm reading the material and I'm working with you, I've noticed my mind is quieter. Normally when I'd be like doing shoots like this, I would think about more scenarios. But I notice now that I'm not spending the same amount of time, where that might go into the night and while I'm sleeping, that doesn't happen anymore.
What do you think that is for you?
Do you know, I think it's just sometimes when you read something or you talk about something and it becomes a forefront of your mind, whilst you're not actively engaged in, like, I'm not actively engaged in doing the act techniques myself, I'm very aware of its presence and its benefit.
So you have been paying attention on occasions?
I have been paying attention, and it has helped with my own.
Oh, there you go. That's nice to hear.
My own stress, in the sense of that it's helped quieten me in the situations. There are still situations where I still get stressed, but that's natural. But I've noticed the things that I would normally worry about, they're quieter and they don't last as long. So for someone who is dealing with, who hasn't come to that yet, and locking the door is just one thing, but in normal life, we have a plethora of different things that are what micro in the grand scheme of things, but you've mentioned that can really, become like chronic stress. What are the long-term effects of ill health with chronic stress, and how can you, with the ACT techniques, how does that help long-term?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's pretty well documented, as I've already alluded to. Insurance companies are concerned. The actuaries in insurance companies are looking at people with chronic stress and going, okay, well, we need to adjust premiums, for those types of people. So that's one of the things that points to the fact that this is a bit of a problem, because they wouldn't be doing that if it wasn't a problem. No. On the other side of the coin, just living in that, stress state all the time can have profound, impacts on our immune system as well. So, if you're living in stress all the time, it's essentially something where your, how shall I put this? Your immune system is kind of revved up, but almost like revved up constantly. But like anything else, it can't be always revved up, because it just won't work effectively for a long, in a revved up situation all the time. So at a certain point, you have a bit of a crash. So you've heard of people who have been really, really stressed, and then they take a bit of a break, and all of a sudden they get incredibly ill.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they might be super stressed for, months. Then they take 2 weeks off over Christmas, and suddenly they pick up the bug and they just laid low for a long period of time.
That has happened to me. I went through a period where I worked for a company, and I think I was about 21, 22, and they were going through redundancy, and I was only just a year or so into owning a house.
Right. Okay.
And that period of time, I think it was about a 3-month period of time, 3 months where that was ongoing. And after it went through, I found out that I wasn't being made redundant, and I went ill. Once the relief of not being stressed, of thank God I'm not being made redundant, things are safe, I was like out for a week, because I came down with the flu, and I was laid up on the sofa for like a good couple of days.
It's not a good situation. But our bodies aren't designed to live in long-term kind of permanent stress. It just doesn't work. We're not designed for that. We're designed, and this is the stress response is there to help us in times of danger and threat, to help us take action as we need to. That's appropriate. Now, that can be appropriate when we're talking about, planning into the future. If there's things that we need to take action on, brilliant. Yeah, that's great. But if we're, stressing over, somebody who works in the next cubicle to us in work, who, we really find difficult to deal with, or we're worrying about whether we lock the house every time we go out, or, you talk, let's take it to a more extreme. You talk about people who've got obsessive compulsive disorder who are, worried about leaving the house because they might have not turned off all the electricity sockets and the house is going to burn down. Those kind of things are, a place that we can't live in that sort of that realm of chronic stress all the time, because it's going to frankly put you in an early grave for a lot of people.
And it's really strange when you talk about things like that and we go, okay, we understand that, but it's like in the same ballpark of if you go into the hospital and you're diagnosed with a heart condition that it's beating too fast, and they'll basically say your body's going at the clappers and it can't handle this.
Yeah.
The downside with stress is that mechanically your heart's not, obviously cortisol, but it's a different thing. And
it's more up here.
Yes.
It's more between the ears than it's
so
actually.
Where you could get a
it's
pacemaker.
You've got a physiological response.
Yeah.
To something, but it's all driven by the brain. And again, coming back to this whole thing about abstract thought, the ability, because as human beings, we can kind of manifest a physiological response to a thought.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? So we can think about this. We can do this catastrophizing about what such and such is going to mean, and if we play that scenario through, even though it's potentially very unlikely, we can cause those physiological responses. It's a bit like, if you close your eyes and imagine sort of squeezing a lemon into your mouth, most people will start to salivate. I can feel myself starting to salivate now.
Well,
just thinking, I'll try not to dribble on your sofa.
I don't have to clean up afterwards. Dad's left some body fluids.
That's grim. That's grim.
That's grim, isn't it? I don't say that. Dad was thinking about lemons and he drooled. So anyway, coming back.
I've completely lost my train of thought after that. So we can manifest a physiological response just because we think of something or we have a thought about it, and that's part of what our abstract thinking brain has allowed us to do. And again, the lemons thing is just a kind of a benign example, but if you do get caught up in thinking around something that you're finding difficult or stressful, have a guess what's going to happen. You're going to start, the heart may begin to race, your body's producing these stress hormones. And if you're feeling like that kind of constantly, and that could be due to, work pressures or anxiety, but often, stress and anxiety kind of go hand in hand because they are, they're kind of like, best friends in many ways. Then, you're going to be living in that situation all the time. And where's the respite? Where's your time for your body to kind of repair itself? If you're never out of that, your body's never getting that opportunity. And consequently, when you do maybe take a break from work or you kind of gain some relief, that's when you tend to get ill. And I think there is, some body of research to show that can happen. But the bottom line is, constant stress, constant cortisol or stress hormone production ain't great for us.
No.
And we, and it should be, short term, we come back into balance. And if that's not happening for you or anybody that's something that needs to be addressed before it does become chronic.
And we're not saying that stress isn't bad. We're just saying prolonged stress.
Prolonged stress is
and
bad.
That's because there's good stress. There's sometimes good stress will allow you to pursue something. Like for me, building this business, I find it healthy stress because I'm constantly looking at ways to improve the relationship between my customers and everything. So it's the type of stress, it's the negative.
Yeah. if we did, I've already said that we need stress in order to survive, because if we didn't have these stress hormones, frankly, we'd probably never get off the sofa to do anything.
Because we have a sofa for you to dribble on.
Well, I'll I haven't dribbled just yet, although I can't promise her.
No,
can't
not
promise
yet.
her. Yeah.
No, coffee now.
Yeah. Oh, I could do with a coffee. Actually.
I know you made me a coffee, and I bloody left it over there. I'm devastated.
Never mind.
So, do you think there's a misconception though with stress, chronic stress, and the effects it have? What do you think that people, there are misconceptions with it?
Yeah, you're right. We need stress. We need stress to function. We need stress often to perform at our best in what we do. And anybody who's ever sort of been up on stage in front of people, and I've had to do presentations and that sort of thing in the past, having a little bit of stress gets you to perform often at your best. But there's been research that's been done out there that shows that when stress reaches a certain tipping point, our performance in whatever endeavor that we're undertaking will start to drop off. So, and it's at that point where we need to worry. But in addition to that, it's when we're in kind of almost constant stress, where the body is just producing. We got thoughts. We're producing these stress hormones because and that can be anything from constant work deadlines, for example, through to challenges in home life, to frankly sitting in a bloody traffic jam.
Yeah, there's traffic jams.
All of those things. Yeah. And it used to drive me nuts. And now I reckon, because I'm still a human being like everybody else, even though I'm doing this stuff. I know it's hard. I know it's hard to believe. But sitting in a car in a traffic jam, as I had to the other weekend, and I felt myself like, the M42 was shut for work. And so I had to be taken off and then go through the roads. It took about 45 minutes longer than it should have done to do this particular journey. And I did feel myself sort of like raising up. And I was like, well, I recognised that. And I didn't engage any more with it than I kind of needed to. And I sort of stepped back from that and had stuck the radio on, stuck some tunes on, and made the best of, a difficult situation. But it's that awareness, it's that kind of recognition up front of what's going on. And I felt myself kind of getting a bit like, tense. And I was like, what's this gonna do for me? What's it gonna help me with? Now, historically, I would have got really cheesed off and potentially quite angry
bad mood for the rest of the day.
Exactly.
So, with everything with ACT, say for instance now, where someone's watching this now and they go, do you know what? I'm really interested in learning more about this and perhaps participating with yourself. What can people expect from, you said, realistic expectations? Because sometimes people will look at it and think, nah, it's not for me. But then there'll be others then that will go, do you know what? I'm going to give this a try. What can people expect from when they're working with you?
So I do a variety of different courses. But the main sort of staple, if you like, is a 2-hour course where I teach people in like an introduction to what we call relational frame theory, which is the science which underpins ACT. So it gives people a bit of a concept, if you like, of how this big old melon between our ears actually works. And I think that's quite crucial. Once we've done that, then we delve a bit more deeply into the pillars of ACT. And what I then do is, and for a lot of people, they'll get some benefit out of using those tools, but I offer then smaller group sessions where we really deep dive into some of the pillars, and other sessions, even one-to-one, to help train people more effectively. And it's, the results speak for themselves, not least, for me. But the one thing I will say is that ACT itself has got over 1,000 published peer-reviewed papers showing its effectiveness. And relational frame theory, which is science underpinned, has got over 500 peer-reviewed papers in terms of, understanding that science.
Yeah.
And again, it's part of the third wave of cognitive modalities, so it's relatively recent, and has been proven to be extremely effective. So for me, what I do with this is my passion, and I love teaching it to people, and a lot of it is because it's helped me so much that I want to kind of share that knowledge out there. And so I took the punt, and here I am.
And you're doing fantastic, and that's one of the reasons why I'm working with you, because I believe in the actual work that you're doing, and it has benefit, and it's something that whilst I'm not actively doing myself, just by working.
There you go. So you're gonna have to now.
I know.
No pressure.
but it is true. It's just being on like the outskirts of the understanding and doing the content with you, and I've been very mindful of the techniques. I've noticed a massive difference in my worry levels and the stress. So it's been really, really like an eye-opener for myself. It is, and it is fantastic. And one of the things that you mentioned, which is something that I am experiencing bad, that is sleep. So how does the cortisol and everything with all these things play into sleep management and you just general health? Because sleep, we've been told that sleep is incredibly important.
Absolutely. Well, stress hormones are designed to kind of keep you awake and alert. That's one of the things that they're there to do, is to keep you ramped up so that you're able to deal with threat. So if you're ramped up, how are you going to sleep? The way the body works is that as it gets dark, the pineal gland produces melatonin.
Yeah.
And it's the melatonin that helps you sleep. But if you've got a battle going on in your system, it's a bit like, if you drink 12 pints of coffee a day, you're probably not going to sleep very well because you've got a ton of caffeine in there. Well, if your body's also producing these other stress hormones, you're probably going to be staring at the ceiling quite a lot. And then people get onto this, what's the right word? This kind of roller coaster, I suppose, of, oh, well, I can't sleep, therefore I'll take, sleeping tablets, or I'll take, something else to try and help me sleep, which often isn't a very effective sleep or very deep sleep, the type of sleep that we need to get, because it's artificial in some way, shape or form, because it's not, it's been done through drugs. And are wondering why they're incredibly stressed every day, because they're not sleeping, they're getting more stressed with whatever's going on in their lives, and they're just exacerbating the situation using, other drugs to try and mitigate it. It's not rocket science. It really isn't.
And it's almost like a double-edged sword, really, because whilst you're suffering with the chronic stress and you're not sleeping, eventually that's going to become chronic fatigue. And they're just going to play off each other.
Absolutely.
So there's another stressing factor.
Yeah. And we won't get into the whole discussion around, because our brains function differently when we're particularly tired as to when we're well rested. We tend to, again, narrow our focus a bit more when we tend to be a little, or can be a bit disinhibited when we're particularly fatigued, which can have downsides as well. I don't want to dive into that too much, but bottom line is we need decent sleep in order to regulate our stress levels. But if we are particularly stressed, we're not going to be able to sleep that well, and often people will try and then use alternative, sometimes extraneous substances in order to help them sleep, which can potentially exacerbate the situation sometimes.
Fantastic. And for businesses that are looking to help their staff, and obviously chronic stress within the workplace is going to be a massive challenge for any business owner, because they're going to have people that are going to be off sick. Yeah. So if they're looking at this and they're going, what potential impact can I have as a boss to help my staff? What's the best way to contact you to talk and to see how you can help?
Well, just the first thing to say is that I train groups.
Yeah.
So it's not about one-to-one typically, although I will do that sometimes, but it's typically about training groups, getting a load of people into a room or onto a Zoom call or a Teams call or whatever, and actually training them. So people can contact me at anxious2zen.com. Or what I should say is anxious-2-zen.com.
We'll put it on screen.
Yeah, we'll put it on screen. That's fine. But there's obviously this YouTube channel where I've got various bits and pieces, and I can be contacted on Dan at anxious-2zen- No, have I done that right again? I've done it wrong again.
We'll put it on screen.
Just put it on screen.
There we go.
It's been a long day today.
It has been a long day.
It's been fun.
But it's been amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Absolute pleasure, my friend. As always, it's a joy to do these things.
I do.
I've had a cracking day today. It's been really, really good. So thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you for joining us. And we will see you again. Bye. I don't know what the hell I was doing there. Then I went for like a thing or dip job. I am so not cool. Typical Welsh,
You're very cool. You're very cool.